Hello, everyone. My name is Maren Wagner. I'm the Executive Director of the Wolf Institute. Thank you very much for joining us again at this webinar series that is jointly run by the Wolf Institute and by the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. We have other partners, the CSIC IMF, the University of Munich, the Medieval Studies Research Group at the University of Lincoln, the Leicester Medieval Research Center, and Ghent University. So this is the third year of us running these webinars. We're very, very pleased that you have stayed such a loyal audience. We had a fantastic number of signups for this webinar, owed to the panel that organized it and the exciting title and the exciting topic. Many of you will be very familiar with the webinars, but for those who are not, I'll introduce the two main host institutions. So one is the Wolf Institute. I am physically in the Wolf Institute in Cambridge. It's a research institute in Cambridge, which focuses on religion and society. And we combine our research with teaching, with public education, with policy work. So please have a look at our website, YouTube channels, and all sorts of other information on the web that you can find on the web to learn more about our work. Now, with my other hat on, the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean was founded in 1997. And it is dedicated to all aspects of the academic study of cross-cultural Mediterranean history from the 5th to the 15th centuries. And this is always the moment where I introduce the journal of the Society. The journal is part of the subscription of the membership. So if you are not a member yet, please consider joining, because you get this amazing magazine into your house 3 times a year. So this is the Society, and very quick introduction of how the webinar works. We have a Zoom webinar audience. We're also live streaming via Facebook. So if you want to rewatch this, or if you want to recommend it to anyone to watch, it will be available from the Wolf Institute Facebook page pretty much immediately after we finish the webinar. And it will also be later available on YouTube. Our topic for today is making martyrs in medieval Iberia. And our chair today will be Kati Ihnat, who is a lecturer in medieval history at the University of Nijmegen, who in turn will introduce the speakers of today. The panelists will present, and they will have a short discussion among themselves while you can prepare the questions for the Q&A session that you'll have afterwards. You can type the questions in your Q&A portal at the bottom of your screen. Please put it into the QA portal, because it makes it much easier for the chair to handle the questions there. At 6 o'clock sharp, we will end the live streaming and the filming, but you're most welcome to stay behind to ask a few more informal questions if you want, and chat to the panelists until they all sign off. So this is now the right time to hand over to the chair. Kati, over to you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And thank you very, very much to the Society for the invitation to present and for the opportunity to share this project, this very exciting project with all of you. All right, so the project that we have been engaged in for the past few years looks at how martyr saints are constructed culturally. And what I mean by culturally constructed is through a variety of different sources. So those being liturgy, material culture, and hagiography. So it's an interdisciplinary exploration of all the materials that make up a saint's cult, and is basically the way in which people would have come to know about saints, would have come to conceive of them, and possibly been inspired by them. And so what we're also doing is looking at this phenomenon over the longue durée. So it's about 500 years worth of Iberian history, and importantly, over the border of the Iberian Peninsula. So both in the northern Christian kingdoms, or the kingdoms that eventually emerged that were Christian, and also Muslim Al-Andalus. So we're trying to understand the veneration of martyrs in a very kind of holistic, from a holistic perspective. And in order to properly embark on this type of research, it was incredibly important for this project to include, on the one hand, a musicologist who could properly incorporate the musical means by which the liturgy was communicated and give it appropriate weight. And that is my colleague, Melanie Shaffer, who came to us from the University of Colorado in Boulder. And on the other hand, it was very important to have an Arabist who could unlock the Arabic language sources, which you will hear about in a little bit, to shed more light on religious practice in Al-Andalus. And that was Cathrien Hoijinck, who is a PhD student with us and who came to us, studied Arabic philology at the Freie Universität in Berlin prior to this. And myself, just to introduce myself, I'm Kati Ihnat. I am a historian of medieval religious culture here at the Radboud University in Nijmegen. And I've been really interested over the past few years of exploring the liturgy and broader sense of ritual, Christian ritual, from a historian's perspective to better understand lived religion. And this project is a part of that broader interest. Now, this project began with a question I had looking at a very peculiar group of individuals. These were the Martyrs of Cordoba. They were about 50 Christian individuals who lived under Islamic rule. So in approximately 10 years in the middle of the 9th century, they presented themselves for martyrdom. And they did this by effectively coming before a judge or coming into a public sphere and publicly blaspheming against the prophet. They did this with the full knowledge that they would effectively be executed for this action, and they were. So about almost 50 individuals were ultimately executed. And there have been lots of questions that have surrounded why they would do such a thing. What was it about Christian culture in Al-Andalus, specifically about this particular group, that drove them to take what seems to be a fairly extreme action? And there's been a really interesting work by Christian Sanner that was recently written that put them into a broader Mediterranean perspective, hence why they're such great fodder for this particular society and this particular webinar venue. Because there were numerous such examples of Christians undertaking martyrdom throughout the Islamic Empire, but not quite so many in such a short period of time. And that has posed lots of questions for historians who are thinking about, okay, well, were they doing this to express a religious or political resistance? Were they taking this action to produce a kind of boundary formation between communities, especially in a context of significant assimilation of Christians to Arabic culture and acculturation? There have also been historians who've wondered whether any of this actually happened and whether it isn't the product of later imaginations. But one study of this particular movement that was inspiring to me, in any case, who's interested in religious culture, was Jamie Wood's article that appeared in the journal of this very society that tried to understand the veneration of martyrs in Cordoba in the 9th century. And no fault of Jamie's, obviously, but one of the elements that I thought would be really interesting to pursue a little bit further in looking at what this religious culture of Christians in this period was the liturgy. Now, the liturgy is interesting for many reasons. It is the primary means through which basically ideas, or how would you say, ideas about religious culture, I suppose, are communicated from elites to the general population, because the liturgy comprises basically everything that happens during the course of a church service. And what's interesting about Iberia is they had a very distinctive and distinct liturgical tradition throughout much of the early Middle Ages. So we know that its roots were already there in the 6th and 7th centuries, and it basically stretched this rite, this very unique rite, was practiced up until the turn of the 12th century, when it was abolished and it was replaced by the Roman rite. So we have a distinct period of time in which this liturgy was practiced, and which has been, as a result, not as studied as other liturgical traditions throughout Europe, because it's peripheral, because it's unique. And this opens up a fantastic opportunity to try and understand specifically how saints were celebrated and commemorated by everyday people, because this represents what was happening in churches all through Iberia. This is what a liturgical manuscript looks like, one of our old Hispanic liturgical manuscripts. And you can see that it has a wide diversity of different kinds of of material. So you have in the green box a hymn, in the red circle, that's a chant, which has music notation over it. In the blue box, you have a prayer. So we have to imagine the liturgy as an assembly of very different types of different materials, of genres. So you have sung elements, you have spoken elements, you have prayers, you have readings, you have a wide variety of different texts that are functioning together and create a web of meaning. And this is what I'm really interested, especially to think about what kind of message it's transmitting about saints and sanctity. When we take the oldest existing liturgical manuscript that we have from the Iberian Peninsula, that's what you see on your screen. Very interestingly, it has liturgies for 34 different saints. And here you have a chart that lists those saints. And you can see that there's quite a strong predominance of Hispanic saints, but you have different other saints that are being commemorated. But perhaps most strikingly is that apart from 3, actually the last one on the table should also be struck out, are martyrs. And this is in a period where you get, in the 7th, 8th century, you already get quite a significant emergence of other kinds of saints, confessor saints, bishops, church fathers, etc., but not represented in the liturgy of Iberia. We see a predominance of martyr saints. And interestingly enough, if we think about some of the possible reasons for this, it could have something to do with the fact that martyr saints were appealing because of their very gory death stories. It could have something to do with antiquity, that martyrs were much older than confessor saints, and therefore they preserved a kind of authority that other saints did not. Or it could be a sort of inherent doubt or a question as to the validity of more recent saints, and a belief that those older martyr saints are safe. They died for the faith. We have no other need to prove their sanctity. And this is exactly what Isidore of Seville tells us in his text, De Ecclesiasticis Officiis, when he says that we honor the martyrs more devoutly since they are more secure, all uncertainties having been conquered. So I'm playing around with ideas as to why martyrs became so dominant in the Iberian liturgy and in Iberian commemoration. This brings us to the question, well, what happens in later centuries? We have Isidore's opinions in the 7th century. Did this kind of doubt about, contemporary saints, confessor saints, then trickle down and potentially explain why a group of individuals in 9th century Cordoba got very excited about becoming martyrs? Well, we have some issues because we have manuscripts that come from the northern Christian kingdoms that tell us about the liturgy that was celebrated there by Christians, but we have very little from Al-Andalus. In fact, almost nothing. And Cathrien will talk a little bit more about the sources that do come from Al-Andalus, and they're listed here. But in our preliminary comparisons of these different source types, here we have the Capitulare Evangeliorum Arabicum, which actually gives us gospel incipits for the Mass of different saints' feasts. So this is definitely a liturgical manuscript. And interestingly, it's in Arabic. So it tells us potentially something about how the liturgy was itself conducted in Al-Andalus. And perhaps most interestingly, if we go to, I don't know why that's not working. There we go. If we go to a comparison between what is contained in this manuscript from Al-Andalus and what we have in that older 8th century manuscript, there is significant overlap. And once again, we have a predominance of martyr saints. So again, we're exploring the idea that there's a possibility that the religious culture in Iberia was very strongly martyr-oriented, and that this continued into the 10th, 11th centuries in Al-Andalus, and that perhaps some of these ideas then may have gone on to influence the movement that we have come to call the Cordoban martyr movement. But I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to invite Melanie Shaffer to talk more about what her role as a musicologist on this project is and what she's uncovering by looking specifically at the music.
So as working as a musicologist on this project, like Kati just introduced, I'm focusing on the chants of the liturgy and what music can tell us about the way that martyrs were commemorated and what was, how they were thought about and what was important to venerate about them. So music is used to make text special, right? It heightens a text and it places it in a different sort of communicative medium. It sets it apart from spoken text. But it's also a teaching tool. Music works to communicate text, to help those who are singing it and listening to it know what's important, and helps people remember it. If you have musical patterns, you tend to remember texts more clearly. So it's a really important tool and a thing to look at in terms of what did the creators of these liturgies want people to think about saints. And I'd like to just show you a couple of examples of ways that I look at the music and some of the things that it can tell us. So one of the things that we can look at in these chants is something called a melisma, which basically means lots of notes sung to one syllable. So if you imagine a pop star singing any sort of common like Christmas carol or a national anthem, they don't sing it straight, right? They add lots of little trills and frills to them, lots of notes all at once. So in these chants, we can look at the syllables of the text that get set to lots of notes. And the Old Hispanic chant has some exceptionally long melismas, and I've circled some of these in an example chant for you. This one at the bottom goes all the way up the side of the page. And we often find these sorts of melismas on typical words like Alleluia, sort of moments of praise, or Amen, or we have one here on Secularum, so forever, where there's a little bit of music imitating what the text actually says. But you also get these on words that are not so obvious or in less obvious places, like not only at the end of a chant. So for example, this first circle here, we have a really long melisma in this chant on the word Israel. So if we look at the broader context of this chant, we might notice that there's an emphasis on the people of Israel, or perhaps contrasting Israel with someone else. And this sort of sonic emphasis means that the word Israel is going to be held out longer. It's going to last longer in the air and draw people's attention to it. So when we look in the context of the rest of the text of the chant or in prayers surrounding it, this helps us get an idea of what the creators of this liturgy really wanted to emphasize and wanted people to have as their take-home message. Another thing that we can look at in music is where we find repeated patterns. So if I said repeated patterns help you to remember things, they also draw connections between text. If you hear the same text, the same music over again, you're likely to connect the bits of text that went with it. So what I have here is a few chunks of a chant sung during the feast of St. Vincent. And in 3 different moments of this chant, we have similar text about water. And the musical notation for each of these moments is almost exactly the same. And I'll talk a little bit more about the notation here in a minute. But for now, you can just look and see how similar the shapes are. So in this chant, in a sense, the idea of water, or that the saint is saved from water, gets its own sonic identity. So maybe you leave the church remembering this little musical pattern about water. And at the moment, Kati and I are working on an article on the cult of St. Vincent, and we're using these chants and their musical emphasis on water as one component of trying to think about the importance of the place of where the saint was from, or where their relics were kept in terms of their veneration. One other thing that we can look at is how music is phrased. So when I say a musical phrase, I mean a unit of music that has a sort of predictable start and end, just like you would think of a text phrase or a music phrase. I mean, a text phrase or clause. If you think about singing to yourself, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star," you kind of know when the song is over and when it isn't. If you just stopped at "Twinkle, twinkle," like it would feel wrong, right? It's because I'm not at the end of a musical phrase. Normally in chants, we find that musical phrases connect to text phrases, because that's the whole point of the music, is to communicate the text. But when we find moments that these aren't synced up, it's a moment to pay attention to what people wanted to be sonically emphasized. So what you're looking at right now is a chant for the feasts of Fructuosus Augurius and Eulogius. and it's reused for another group of 3 saints. And in this chant, the saints being commemorated are being likened to Old Testament figures, 3 men who are thrown into the fiery furnace in Babylon: Ananias, Azarias, and Mishael. And the names of those 3 saints I have here in red boxes. And the music sort of uncharacteristically comes to the end of a musical phrase after each of these names. And usually at the end of a musical phrase, a singer is going to take a breath. So here you would imagine this chant would be sung such that you have someone singing Ananias, Azarias, and Mishael, and hopefully they're not actually gasping for air, but for dramatic effect. You can imagine that this really isolates the name as people are listening and makes it really important. So this is one of the ways that you notice in this liturgy, this parallel with these Old Testament biblical figures is really important. And people are going to remember this moment. And this ties into a web of other texts that links these saints to these biblical figures and works in a lot of interesting cultural associations. We have a couple of problems. Well, I won't call them problems. I'll call them challenges with Old Hispanic notation, though, which is that we don't know what the actual notes are. So if you see some of these patterns that look like a check mark, we can tell it's a gestural notation. So if you imagine writing it with a pen, when your pen changes direction, that's a change of a note going up or down. So we can tell if something is going to a higher note or a lower note, but we don't know what those exact notes are, and we don't know by how much it's going up or down. So a lot of the typical ways that people have analyzed music in terms, especially like phrases, is to look at pitch. Is it ending on the note of the mode of the chant? But we don't have access to that kind of information. But we have some handy tools that have been developed to help us with some of this, and other scholars, especially people like Emma Hornby and Rebecca Malloy, have done enormous work in helping us get insight into this notation. But I want to briefly show you how I use the chant editor and analysis program to work on something like a musical phrase when I don't have access to pitch. So I'm going to see if I can share a different window. So here I'm pulling up the chant that I just showed you about. Hopefully you can see if you can see my cursor, here's Azarias, Mishael, Ananias here. So because these are sort of odd moments where you might not expect a musical phrase, I can check my interpretations. You have a sense after you look at this for a while of what neumes often get used at the end of musical phrases, but I can also check. So I can select strings of neumes, and then I can ask the database to look for patterns that are similar to this found at the end of text phrases. So if I get a lot of hits back, then that tells me this musical pattern of notation happens in other chants at the ends of text phrases, which is where we expect a musical phrase to end, which would help me confirm my interpretation. So this is not the most typical cadence, but I have quite a few. I have quite a few matches, and I can compare them to the chant that I have here. So here's the original chant at the top, and then here below, I can see, okay, this is actually a fairly similar pattern. And it's not crazy for me to think that there is a cadence here. I can do the same thing I could try the next phrase and see, is this a musical pattern that often goes at the beginning of a chant, a beginning of a musical phrase, and double check myself that way as well. So even though we have challenges with the notation, there's lots of ways that we can use the music to tell us about saintly construction. And I will go back to our slides now and hand it over to Cathrien.
My research is focusing on Andalusi sources, as Kati said, and in particular the Cordovan calendar. That is one of the only sources that might tell us something about the liturgy of Christians in Al-Andalus. But this is not a collection of actual material used in the liturgy, as we see in the sources of the north. So what is it then? The Cordovan calendar is an Arabic almanac, supposedly written around 961 for Caliph al-Hakam II. Since there are 11 manuscripts identified as versions of the Cordovan calendar, I tend to speak of the Cordovan calendars in plural. There is no original, and the extant versions differ significantly from each other. As is common for Arabic almanacs of this type, it consists of different elements: astronomical, meteorological, medical, agricultural, etc. Yet this text does also include a Christian liturgical calendar, which is not very standard. Almanacs and calendars are in the same time difficult and very exciting sources to work with. They are never literally copied. Instead, they are living texts that are adjusted to new contexts. Next slide, please. This source became an important source for understanding religious life of Christians in 10th century Cordoba. But rather than treating it as a truthful reflection of religious practice, I consider this a great source for understanding the engagement of Muslims with the customs and rituals of their Christian neighbors. At the moment, I try to determine how to read this source, and specifically the liturgical calendar. Can we assume that this reflects actual practice? Where did the author get his knowledge from? Did he rely on observation or on a text that was available to him? Was it composed with an economic or administrative/fiscal or otherwise practical purpose in mind? Or was it rather an encyclopedic work, a way to gain prestige and to show off as a ruler over a diverse realm? One of the things that I do to answer these questions is to compare the Cordovan calendars to one another and to other liturgical calendars from the peninsula. The first comparison, Cordovan calendars to one another, serves to understand the text transmission and how the perspective of the authors or copyists changes from manuscript to manuscript. This will contribute to understanding how communities lived together and perceived each other and themselves. The second comparison, Cordovan calendars in relation to other calendars in Iberia, serves to find out if there was a universal rite being practiced by Christians on the peninsula. Do Andalusi Christians orientate towards the north in their practice, or maybe to Eastern Christian communities that lived in a similar situation, namely under Islamic rule? Next slide, please. As to the comparison of different versions of the Cordovan calendars, sometimes it is clear that the Saints canon is replaced by a calendar that reflects the new context. For example, some manuscripts that contain saints of which we know that they were only sanctified in later centuries. In the case of the Cordovan calendars, this means also that we find versions of the text with combinations of, for example, Old Hispanic elements, together with saints from other traditions, such as the Catalan tradition or Franco-Roman tradition, but also combined with Jewish, Coptic, and Islamic feasts and commemorative events. Next slide, please. I compare the manuscripts of the Cordovan calendars to other Old Hispanic calendars by collecting all the calendrical entries as data. This is what you see on the slide. This quantitative method makes it possible to easily track the similarities and differences of certain feasts in the manuscripts of the Cordovan calendar that would be otherwise difficult. Next slide, please. This comparison generates graphs such as the one shown here. When compared to Old Hispanic calendars, we see first of all that there are several clusters of calendars that are closer to each other. For example, to the very left, we see the Verona Orational and the Capitulare Evangeliorum Arabicum that Kati also mentioned, and their similarity because they're extremely close, almost on top of each other. We can also find in the left bottom corner kind of cluster of the Cordovan calendar manuscripts that I selected for this graph in red. They are closer to each other than to other manuscripts. On the other hand, the clusters in general differ as much from one another as the Cordovan calendars do from them. This means that there are differences between what we find in the northern and in the southern manuscripts, being the Cordovan calendars, but not more than calendars in the north differ from one another. That means, based on this quantitative method of calendar comparison, there is no significant difference between the supposed saints canon in Al-Andalus and the northern kingdoms. Next slide, please. Besides the quantitative comparison, I also looked closer into a few distinctive features of the Cordovan calendars that I generated as a list of which we see a part here. The list reveals the entries that only appear very few times or even never in any other source than the Cordovan calendar. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. The Ansara, for example. This word was used in Arabic to designate the solstice festival that would coincide in the Christian calendar with John the Baptist. And Ansara became almost an equivalent to saying the feast of John the Baptist. John the Baptist was one of the major Christian festivals, generally celebrated with bonfires. But apparently Muslims took part in such celebrations or even held their own events. The hybrid practice was a reason for Islamic jurists to warn Muslims to not participate in these celebrations or eat the festive food or to accept gifts on that day. In one of the Latin versions, based on a translation of the 12th century, some voluntary martyrs of Cordoba or neo-martyrs with whom Kati started her talk are present. However, none of these have made it into the northern calendars, and there is no evidence of their cult or liturgy anywhere else. Since these martyrs also only appear in one of the versions of the Cordovan calendars and not in 10 other versions, it is valid to ask if they were ever really celebrated, or if they are an addition of later centuries. They could be the product of a Christian community using the past to tell a certain narrative about the suppression under Islamic rule. An outstanding element are the few Coptic feasts that are mentioned in at least 5 of the Cordovan calendar manuscripts. Is it possible that Coptic feasts were celebrated in Cordoba? My conclusion at the moment is no. There are no sources that attest the physical presence of Copts on the peninsula, although I assume that their calendars were available to scholars or high officials of the court. The presence of these feasts in the Cordovan calendar seems to be, based on the way these feasts are described, rather a literary choice. It could have added to the universality and the prestige of the calendar. Another unsolved question is the Jewish feast and Islamic commemorative events that appear in some of the Arabic manuscripts. Could they have been part of the Ur-text and stem from the 10th century? On the first sight, no. They appear for the first time in a 13th century manuscript from Cordoba that has included some material from later sources as well. However, the 13th century manuscript has some curious details in common with a Latin version that is often approached as if it was the 10th century original because of its very detailed description of places of worship in Cordoba. If both sources were indeed more loyal to a common original source than some other manuscripts that lack these events, there could have been originally Jewish feasts and Islamic commemorative events in the Cordovan calendar of the 10th century. On the other hand, some Islamic political commemorative events are also present in Egyptian calendars of the Mamluk and Ayyubid period, and could as well have been copied from these calendars that were imported into Al-Andalus and not reflect Cordoban reality. As you can hear, this is still an unsolved question, but it's an important and interesting possibility that has to be explored. Thank you very much.
We'll end with Eulalia. Thank you so much to both Cathrien and Melanie for your talks. And I think because we have lots of discussions amongst ourselves all the time, as you can imagine. We'll just throw open the questions to those who are in attendance. So I'm just looking at the Q&A just to see whether there's anyone who might have a question. And we welcome questions on any of the aspects that we have been exploring, whether it be how you incorporate musical sources into your historical study, how you deal with calendars, what you do with interesting hybrid sources, and yeah, any of the above, or martyrs in general. Well, we'll give, let's see. We have a comment that there's at least one reference to Christians from Egypt in Umayyad al-Andalus. Cathrien, you have not come across this. This would be very interesting actually to get as a reference. So if there is, if there's the chance of someone, the poster transmitting this reference, or at least an idea of where we could find this, would this be in the context of trade?
Maybe we can.
No.
Okay. Maybe. Do you remember what kind of reference? Because in a way, in the Cordoban calendar, the Coptic feasts that are mentioned are, of course, also a reference to what Copts were doing, but they're not revealing if that was done in Egypt or that was done in Al-Andalus. I assume it was done in Egypt. It refers to customs being practiced in Egypt. But from this comment, I understand that it was Christians being in Al-Andalus.
Yeah, that would be excellent. So if we could get that reference, that would be excellent. Thank you. Another question: have you done much research into how representative these cases were when compared to both geographically different areas and surrounding chronological periods? And that's an excellent question. One of the things that we've realized in dealing with this project is that how little has been done on a sort of holistic level of trying to understand sanctity, especially from a liturgical perspective. There's so much work done on hagiographical sources and what hagiographical narratives say about the evolution of sanctity in the Christian world. Less has been done to try to integrate actual liturgical sources, which, ironically enough, is the sort of form in which saints are actively commemorated. And although hagiography is a part of that, it is only one element of a much larger complex of texts that are used to commemorate a saint. One of the things that has really struck me is, and this has been noted by other scholars and is still sort of an existing mystery, is in that earlier period in the 7th century, 6th, 7th century, you get a mini explosion of hagiographical material in places like Gaul, in Italy, also further east, that are promoting new kinds of saints. So you get the confessor saints. So you have monks and bishops, and a prime example is Saint Martin of Gaul, of Tours, who are getting texts written about them. And we don't really have an equivalent in Iberia. We have a couple of exceptional examples, like Aemilian and Fructuosus, who also get hagiographical texts. But neither of those have any liturgical commemoration, at least for our earlier period. And so that's something that we're exploring to understand whether this is a feature of the liturgy itself. Maybe liturgy is more conservative insofar as it tends to venerate martyrs before it venerates any other kinds of saints, or whether something is going on in Iberia that makes the elites a little more wary of incorporating these confessor saints. All right, another question. What Arabic resources did the project use, or the project tried to see this historical event from an Arabic or Islamic point of view? So I'm assuming you're referring to the Martyrs of Cordoba specifically. Cathrien, did you want to speak to that question? What kind of Arabic sources we have that reflect?
Yes, the judicial sources that I mentioned, for example, which are amongst others, Wan Sharisi, Azafi, Qadi Iyad, Turtushi. These are a few of the legal sources that I have incorporated. And this is discussable, but the calendar and also other calendars that I have seen from Egypt seem to have a Arabic or Islamic framework. So I wouldn't say that they represent per se the Islamic point of view, but because I see that they're quite hybrid, but at least there is also an Islamic element in them, and that is what I am looking at.
Thanks, Cathrien. There's another question about what happens when basically the Roman Rite gets imposed in 1080, and that certain churches, and this is true, do retain the privilege, I suppose, or the right to celebrate the old Hispanic office. And you can visit the chapel, the so-called Mozarabic chapel in Toledo Cathedral, actually, that still continues to perform this rite. One of the things that we have to be very careful of, however, is that basically this rite was, in a sense, rediscovered and revived in the 16th century. So there was a reform undertaken by Cisneros, and he basically assembled a whole bunch of material. And what was missing, what did not coincide with what he already knew from what was being practiced in the Roman Rite, was effectively introduced. And so if you encounter, for example, the Mozarabic Missal as an addition, it's a very tricky source to work with because it has incorporated some of that newer, potentially invented 16th century stuff. So it is a tricky thing to try and untangle. And we have colleagues who are also trying to understand what happens to the Sanctorale, so the canon of saints that gets celebrated prior to the imposition of the Roman Rite and then post. It's a whole additional question, which is fascinating, and hopefully we will have in the coming years some more answers as to how exactly they do that. But it does become a kind of hybrid liturgy where certain things are preserved and other things are imposed from the Roman Rite. Do you want to read out some of the questions, Melanie?
I think we have another one for Cathrien. Do we know where the different versions of the calendar come from, or do we have to guess based on their contents?
Yes, and yes, we have to guess partially based on their content, but I also try to guess based on their on the objects, the manuscripts themselves, looking at the script and signs of usage, that kind of things. But from some, there have been guesses. So I'm not doing this all on myself, of course. So for example, the 13th century manuscript that I was talking about at the end, that also contains Jewish feast and Islamic commemorative events. That one is situated in either Cordoba, Seville, or Granada, one of the intellectual centers from that time. The Judeo-Arabic manuscript is from Huesca. The 12th century Latin translation that we don't have anymore, but the 13th century copy is most probably from Toledo. The one that is now in Tehran has a Maghrebi script, so most probably also not from Tehran, but from North Africa, Al-Andalus. There's one in Alexandria that is very late and has no Maghrebi script. And there's another one that is Arabic, and it's in Paris, and it has not been studied, not been edited, and it has also no Maghrebi script, and it's probably 16th century. So there has still a lot to be done. I have to see some of these manuscripts also. Haven't seen all of them. Hope this answers the question.
Let's see. We had a question from Anna Richabad, but I think it has been answered. So maybe go to the next one. Concerning the table shown by Kati, have you considered the changes of dates in the calendar where the same saints are venerated in Al-Andalus and Oviedo as a sign of adopting the celebration of the same saints in the East? Not Coptic, but Byzantine or Melkite. The ones I've checked coincide.
Thanks for that question. I'm just wondering, perhaps I'm just curious about whether it's the change of date, like that a feast is celebrated on a different date, for example, in the Andalusi source versus in the northern source. If that and this being a sign that in Al-Andalus, they're actually directly importing the feast from the East. And actually, I think Cathrien's work on calendars can best speak to this. So maybe, Cathrien, this is a question for you. So whether you see if there's a discrepancy in the date on which a saint's feast is celebrated, whether the Andalusi calendars better reflect an Eastern tradition that is different from the Northern tradition.
Well, there are some differences in date, but to be honest, I have not been able to examine that very closely yet. But we see outstanding differences, a few in how to frame a certain feast. So, for example, the Judeo-Arabic manuscripts speaks of the purification of Mary and not the presentation in the temple, which is also more Eastern Christian name for that feast, or formulation, or a way of framing that feast. So that's something that I definitely want to check further. How come it's not called the presentation in the temple, although it's in some other Arabic manuscript called presentation in the temple, but in the Judeo-Arabic it's purification of Mary. So this possible link is definitely a very interesting one to check. I also found basil in a few of the manuscripts, actually in the one of Tehran and Alexandria, if I'm right. But since it's not very clear to me yet how these manuscripts connect to the other ones and where they are exactly from, I did not really know if these were additions of later textual layers or from earlier layers. So I don't know if that was something that in the 10th century was adopted or not. And the Melkite possible influence is also interesting because of what I have seen, the only earlier kind of almanac source that we know that is similar is from Masawai, and he was an historian, but I was also checking if their feast coincide with what we find in the Cordovan calendar, and this was not directly the case. They mention a lot of markets, great big markets happening. But yeah, Melkite is another new step to be taken. And I know that Michael Forcada is looking at Byzantine, or the possible influence of Byzantines and Byzantine calendars on something that appears in the 13th century manuscript of the Cordovan calendar, where, for example, also basil is mentioned, but in a strange way, because the anwa that characterize these almanacs are turned into feast. So it's called Now of Basil, for example. So something very interesting that I hope we hear soon more about.
All right, there's a great methodological question. Could you tell us more about how liturgical sources help us to understand the idea of sanctity? And is there something specific about an Iberian idea of sanctity that comes across through these sources? Melanie, do you want to kick off by talking about your musical chants?
Yeah, and maybe I could say something that answers a little bit of both parts of the question, which is that one unique element of the Old Hispanic rite, the fact that chants and prayers are really closely tied together, especially in the dawn office called matutinum. You get a chant, and then it's immediately followed by a prayer, and then another chant and another prayer. And like I showed, where you have these sort of musical emphases on certain aspects of the text, the prayers that follow immediately afterwards interpret the chant for you in a different medium and tell you basically how to understand the scripture reference that was the basis of the chant. And usually the emphases in these prayers coincide with the musical emphases that you get in the chant. So you have a really clear musical and textual tie in the liturgy that is interpreting scripture in a particular way, telling you how to understand these biblical typologies in the veneration of the saints that you're talking about. And so I'm not sure that what a saint is unique to Iberia, although I'll let Kati talk a little bit more about that. She has worked on some of our earlier theological sources, but I do think that there is a unique way that the Old Hispanic liturgical sources help us understand like a broader program of teaching people about saints.
Yeah, so the liturgy itself gives us some unique insights into this question. And picking up on that idea of what sort of idea of sanctity is being transmitted, one of the interesting things that we found by looking at our liturgies is in the rest of the European tradition, you get something that develops in the 10th and 11th century called a historia, which is basically a retelling of the saint's life in the liturgy through chant. So they basically, they create chants that over the course of an office will tell you more or less what the saint's life was. Oh, here's where he was born. Here's what he did. Here are the miracles that he performed, and here's where he died, and gives you a little potted biography in chant. The Old Hispanic liturgy does not do this. The Old Hispanic liturgy gives you a theme. It's almost like, if you think about the way medieval iconography works, if you think of a saint, you have an image immediately of something that's associated with that saint. For St. Cathrien, it's the wheel. And if you think about it in that way, the liturgy does a similar thing. It picks one image that's associated with the saint, and it makes it the basis for the whole liturgy. So it's kind of a liturgical iconography. So for Vincent, it's water. So should I hand off to Jess to conclude this session?
Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you to Kati for organising and chairing such a wonderful session, and to Cathrien and Melanie for their great presentations. Thank you.